That's the crazy thing about economics. It is this almost unsolvable puzzle. I find myself less interested in the make a lot of money part and just perpetually more interested in the how does this work part and how can I help people understand how does this work part. My mom pretty much stayed pregnant for 15 years. I have 7 brothers and sisters. The one rule in our house was come back before it's dark. So one night I'm trying to impress her and I go to this supermarket and I buy fresh sushi and I take it back home. I throw it in the freezer because I'm like, this is fish. Like,
raw
you gotta,
fish. I gotta keep
it's
it.
raw fish. You got to freeze this, right? I throw it in the freezer. She comes over at like 6 o'clock and I threw it in the microwave. I was like, you got to thaw this, obviously. I've just never been married to a specific process and school of thought because I don't think that there is any specific school of thought that just always works all the time.
Welcome to The Intentional Investor with Matt Zeigler, where he and his guests explore the intersection of investing and life, portfolio and purpose. Nothing in this podcast is investment advice. Nothing in this podcast is advising you to buy or sell any security or to do anything with your money. Seriously, you should only act on investment advice from someone you know and who knows your unique situation. We are not that person. Matt Zeigler is a managing director at Sunpoint Investments, and the opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Sunpoint Investments or of Second Foundation Partners. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of Sunpoint Investments.
You're watching The Intentional Investor right here on Epsilon Theory YouTube. I'm your host, Matt Zeigler, and this guest now, for the Tony Hawk pro skater demographic, or the actual skaters, in case there's like 6 of you left out there somewhere, there probably are. This guest, kind of like how Rodney Mullen didn't invent the Ollie, but he sure did make it famous. This guest did that same thing, because he didn't invent modern monetary theory, but he sure popularized it like nobody else. And just to hop sports a little bit, this guest, he's kind of the CR7 of economic set piece takes, as in you line up a bunch of variables and data, state clearly this is the story, you can't score on this. And then this CR comes along and he finds a way over or under or even through that wall to score points you didn't even think you could imagine, but you marvel at it. You marvel at the brilliance of the art form. And finally, I'm going to be NBA jamming on this one too. I can't skip this opportunity. Totally mixing my sports and video game references all the way today. Call me Tim Hardaway, not just because I can't dunk, but because if anybody is on fire from way downtown in this conversation, he's the Chris Mullen of this conversation. With that OG Golden State energy, I'll be serving him the rock all day. Ladies and gentlemen, the most fun disciplined funds founder, the of course I am confidence behind Orcam Financial, the most magnetic economist, and the most pragmatic capitalist I know, Cullen Roche. Welcome to the show.
Oh, man. I don't look at my hair, though. You can't call me the Chris Mullen of anything these days.
I don't know.
That dude had the sweetest buzz cut of all time.
He looks so good. He looks so good. From coast to coast working that hair. And you're lucky we had to punt a little bit on this one. I noticed in the notes I had running here, you almost ended up the Ferrero Rocher of personal finance back when we were closer to Valentine's Day. So I just wanted to give you that one in case you did that.
Well, there's a ongoing debate about the way to pronounce my last name in my family because my wife, so her last name, her maiden name was Fries.
Okay.
Like French fries. Sure. And mine, Roche, pronounced Roche traditionally. And she's like, this doesn't work for me. We can't either choose between the Roche family or the Fries family. Like, those are both bad options. So why don't we just take yours? We'll just say Roche and make it sound sort of suave and smooth.
You got to do it. You got a generation before anybody questions it.
I don't even know where the family origin really is. I mean, my guess is that way, way back, there's some French origin. And I have a mother-in-law who lives in Paris. So I'm kind of like, I don't want to be Parisian or French, but I could go with having the smooth, French sounding last name.
Come on. Your kids will love it. They'll get the correct people all the time. Yeah. They won't be, right now, what do you say? Roach like the bug? How do you have to explain the name?
Yeah, and so my oldest daughter is Della Beau, and my next one is Liv Jolie. So this plan is in motion.
You've teed them up. You've
Yeah.
already teed them up
Yeah.
for the fancier name. You gotta jump right on that.
Yeah,
waste
when
no
they
more.
both end up living in Paris one day, I'm just going to be like, God, this was all my fault. It's my fault that they've moved 10,000 miles away from me.
You incepted the emotional damage. All right, I'm making you start with this. I'm reading you this not to make you feel old, not to endanger the Chris Mellon hair in any more way of shape or form. But I want you to respond to this. This is straight off the website. He was named one of top Wall Street economists, experts, and opinion leaders of 2011, 101 best finance people by Business Insider, most influential economic thinkers today in 2015, top 40 under 40 in Investment News not long after that. In real time, does this stuff feel validating? Does this make you feel old now to hear some of this stuff? Like 2011, 2015?
You know what makes me feel really old is when I go back, I'll see something on Twitter and I'll be like, that guy's wrong about this. And I know I've written about this, and I'll go and Google it and I'll type in, like endogenous money, pragcap.com, and it'll pop up and it'll be like 2010 article that I wrote. And then I'm like, and then I go on Twitter and I'm like, I wrote this 15 years ago. When you start getting in that, it's like the old thing where, like, for us, where we look up, like, you'll see some guy who's like, the hot new all-star in the NBA, and you're like, who is this dude? And you look him up, you look up his bio, and you're like, born 2005, and you're like, holy crap, like.
I went to high school with his dad.
This is so sad.
Yeah.
This guy, I was in my mid-20s when this guy was born, and now he's like a multimillionaire and, making the NBA All-Star team and stuff. It's like, yeah, I struggle with keeping up with young kids playing pro sports now.
Did in real time, like in 2010, in 2015, as you're getting some of this stuff, as you're getting recognized for the work, because this is one of the parts where just indexing you in age was tricky for me, because it's like, I think I'm the same age as him, but I feel like I've been reading him for like 15 plus years at this point, 20 years. Was it good for you? Was it good for your brain to like see some of this stuff in real time when it was happening, to like feel this love around you?
Well, it's weird in retrospect, because honestly, a lot of it in real time was probably, I don't want to say fraudulent, but like undeserved, certainly. Because like I've never had the credentials to be considered like a top economist of anything. So that's always been kind of strange, because I think, especially with like the economic tilt, like people sometimes think of me as like someone who knows a lot about economics or the monetary system. And this is all sort of stuff that, I did study, economics at Georgetown, but it's not like I went through like a PhD program and got like a formalized, econ PhD. So I've always been cognizant of all that, and sort of intentionally so, in the sense that a lot of my approach to all this stuff has been trying to be sort of hyper objective and not attached to any sort of school. Like, some people think of me as like being sort of adjacent to like the MMT people, or like post Keynesian people, or like new Keynesian economists. And I'm not. I've really like tried to make an effort of like distancing myself from any specific school, because I don't like being pigeonholed into, not being able to believe in a certain thing at a certain time, because the economy is so complex that it evolves and changes over time, and you can't pigeonhole yourself in these sorts of views. And so it is weird in retrospect, just because, and Pragmatic Capitalism, the blog, for people who don't know, it's something that I started during the financial crisis as like a personal journal, and it was a public website, but I started it anonymously. And what happened basically, and the cool thing about that blog, and the way it's sort of like, I kind of caught lightning in a bottle with it. The cool thing though with it is that it's a story that anybody could have done, like almost anybody. I just happened to be in the finance space with an interest in this specific thing. And I had been ranting about the housing market and sort of a credit bubble for years. And when the financial crisis started to brew and unfold, it was just something that I started writing about. And I had a couple pieces that very randomly, I was posting to Twitter, but very randomly got cited by some Bloomberg journalists in a Bloomberg article way back when, and overnight, like the website goes from like basically me reading it and a handful of people on Twitter to overnight the traffic went up to like 100,000 views one day. And I was like, this is like a few months after I just started writing this. And this is late 2008, so obviously everything's very scary and everything's kind of catching eyeballs at that point. But by like early 2009, the website was doing 2 million page views a month. And
God.
I had advertising deals by the middle of the year where I was, it was making, at one point, it's making $250,000 a year for me. This thing I had just started, and, which was also sort of fortuitous because my actual investment business at the time was barely making any money. Like I went like 6 months of almost making no money because I was running a private partnership at the time. I basically like shut down all trading for like almost all of 2009 because the market was just so broken and I couldn't, like the strategy I'd been running for years just stopped working because everything was so broken. And so it was sort of fortuitous for me, but at the same time, it was weird because, I'm getting all this attention out of nowhere for something that I really have no history or background in researching or writing about. But it was just such a strange time because people were so curious to know what was going on. And for whatever reason, what I was writing and explaining, and that was part of it, was that I was, to a large degree, just explaining what was going on. So, it was almost like I was trying to sort of do something, I guess, that's kind of like Vox Media, where you're sort of explaining the news. I was explaining the financial crisis as it was unfolding and, like, hey, this is how the monetary system works and this is how banks work and this is why the credit they've created is now exploding and causing this big ripple effect through the whole economy. That was just in huge, huge demand back then. So it was weird, though, definitely, that I was not credentialed and really qualified in sort of the traditional way to be writing about all this stuff. So yeah, a lot of the either, attention or, so-called awards that people would, bestow on me definitely felt undeserved.
Well, lots of great ways to discover your work, not the least of which by having it being something people want to talk about, read about, and learn about when the world's trying to end. So let's go.
Yeah.
Let's go way back in time. Mom and dad. Before we talk about how you have way too many siblings, mom and dad. What do mom and dad do? What's the early days of the household look like for you?
So mom was a nuclear lobbyist in DC and by day, and she was getting a master's at night, and she goes on a date with a DC cop. And my dad was a former Marine, grew up really poor in Connecticut, and I think kind of a rough upbringing. And so kind of a rough around the edges guy. And first date, he takes her to see a movie called Pumping Iron. My dad he was obsessed with bodybuilding, and for whatever insane reason thought that, I guess maybe taking, a girl to see naked men on stage was, I don't know, maybe not the worst
Romantic.
idea, come to think of
It's
it.
romantic.
But yeah, that movie is not romantic. So I don't know. My theory is that he was like testing her, let's see how resilient this woman is and whether she can really, stand.
Was it a
stand up to
blind
me
date
for a few hours?
Where did the date come from? Blind date, friend date? Do you know the story?
It was a friend date. So they met through a friend, and they go on this date. She liked him enough to go on a second date. The rumor is the second date was a strip club. So,
Really
I guess you
testing all the way around.
got to see the naked men on the first date. Now dad gets to see the naked ladies on the second date or something. But they, she weathered that storm, and my dad at the time he was a DC cop by day, and he was going to George Mason Law School in DC at night, and so with the intention to become an attorney, and they they stayed together. And then they started having kids basically for like 15 years straight.
They made a good run out of it.
And they did. My mom pretty much stayed pregnant for like 15 years. So I have 8 brothers. There's 8 of us total. So I have 7 brothers and sisters. So my childhood was kind of crazy, in the sense that, we were the sort of stereotypical generation where we went outside at 8 in the morning and we came back. The one rule in our house was come back before it's dark. And my dad worked his buns off. I never saw my dad in the morning. He was gone all day. He'd walk in the door Monday through Friday at like 7 o'clock. We'd sit down. We'd eat dinner for, an hour together. And, old school Irish family. We had, meat and mashed potatoes almost every night growing up. And, that was just like the ritual. And, my dad would sit at the head of the table and fart halfway through the meal. And, we'd all sit there, and he was hilarious. And, although he was not around during the week, he was like incredibly, incredibly attentive and present on the weekends, like almost overly so. So he's almost like this. My dad, in a lot of ways, is like this mythical creature in that he he was a Marine and a DC cop, and then he became this like, not necessarily famous attorney, but like a really, really successful plaintiff attorney in DC, and very, started his own business, ran his own firm for years and years, and still does. I mean, he still goes into the office a few times a week, at the age of, 78 or whatever now. But he was, it's crazy in retrospect because he coached half of our sports teams. And so he made time for us, but also, my parents were interesting because like they were very like hyper disciplined with us, but also really pushed us to be hyper independent. And they did some unusual things. Like I've mentioned in the past that like I have chickens at my house. And I think part of that is that my parents sent me to a farm school when I was a kid. And so I grew up around farm animals all the time. And, back then it's kind of a cool progressive thing to do now. But, back then it was weird.
Were you DC proper, or are you DC like burbs? Like how far from
I went
DC?
We grew up in Alexandria, so in the suburbs of DC. I went to school in Fairfax County. I went to high school in the city, and then I went to college in the city. So I spent a lot of my childhood in the city proper, even though I didn't live there properly.
And we're going back to this farm school for a second because I have questions specifically about this. You're number 3 of 8. What number are you?
I'm number 3 of 8. So we got 3 boys, 4 girls in a row, and then a boy who's 5 years separated.
Well,
so
we'll just
I won't say anything about that one.
Miracles and mistakes are sometimes very closely related. What can I say?
No, he's fabulous.
That's awesome.
He's probably the one with the the best head on his shoulders out of the bunch. So
well, as I've learned from many of these conversations, sometimes I'm sure, and that's youngest baby brother. Is that who's at the bottom there?
Baby brother, yeah.
Like baby brother has a totally different experience with your parents than any of you had, right?
Yeah. Well, it's weird. I in a lot of ways, like I don't want to say I was his dad, but I was 12 years old when he was born. So like I was very aware of like the baby in the family, and I was around all the time then because I was in like whatever 8th grade and then high school basically through, all of his youth. And so I was hyper present just every day, and I was kind of obsessive with him because he was the next boy on the ladder there. And so, and that's, there are a lot of, not that any of us are, like especially messed up, but the younger ones definitely got the benefit of learning from the older ones and seeing. I mean, it's true for me too. Like I got to see my oldest brother made some mistakes along the way, and I would see these things occur, and I could say, "Oh, okay, all right, that's a bad thing to go to jail for. Don't do that. Don't get arrested for that, or don't go paint that school, on a Friday at 12 o'clock. So things like that where I kind of got to see them make a lot of mistakes and learn from it. And, especially so though with, the youngest brother, where you can tell he's almost like hyper conservative, I think, because he's seen so many mistakes across the other 7.
That's so interesting. All right, tell me about this. I think that's going to come up somewhere else, I'm sure, too. Tell me about this farm school. I remember very distinctly in the part of like northeastern Pennsylvania I grew up, we had one of these, and it wasn't normal kids who went to this school. It was like kids who like lived on farms and whatever else. And every now and then you'd meet one of them and you'd be like, wait, like what? You're chasing cattle around during the day while like I'm in math class. So A, how'd you even find out about this school? Or did your parents find out? Did any of your siblings go to this school? Like how normalized was this to you when you jumped in?
Yeah, well, so we all went there. We were all there at one point. I think all 7 of the older ones were there at the same time. I think that's right. Or like 6 of us. There were a bunch of us. There was like one year where my oldest brother was in 8th grade, where like basically almost all of us were at the school at the same time, which was pretty crazy. But it was it was an old farm that, I mean, the school I think had been started in like 1950 or something. So it wasn't like a new school or something. It had been around for a long time. And it just so happened to have a big farm right in the middle. And then there were, I guess it was a K through, actually it was a pre-K. It was a pre-K through 8. So, a fairly big school, probably 150, 200 students or something like that. And just very, very alternative thinking. Like I grew up in a very Roman Catholic family, and at no point during the school year did anyone ever talk about anything Catholic. Like the only holidays we actually ever celebrated at this school were strange ones, or at least strange to me back then, like things like Kwanzaa, and like we would do like the Santa Lucia procession every year. These like kind of like foreign religions and celebrations that were definitely not normalized in America. And I think a part of that seemed sort of strange at the time, but in retrospect, it was like you could tell there was a very specific, process behind all this, where they were trying to force the kids to be sort of, think outside the box, be, get used to like diversity and stuff like that. I know that like the whole DEI thing right now is very controversial and whatnot, but like that was this was the 80s. I mean, this was a long time ago compared to what's popular today. So this was way, way ahead of its time in a lot of ways. But the thing for me that I always took from all this, and I think the thing that was sort of formational for me, was that it drove me to think in a very outside the box way, where to this day, I'm impacted by the ability to think and step back from things in a far less biased way, because I was obviously growing up like very, very biased by the religion that I practiced, and being forced to be around people who weren't like me, who celebrated different things and whatnot. It forced me to, I think, embrace and understand a lot of things that I was sort of uncomfortable with, which has benefited the way that I think about things and the way that I process things, especially, when it came to like economics and finance. I've never been quick to embrace like the mainstream narratives about everything. I've always been sort of, quicker to question the most common thinking about a lot of things, because that's just the way that I think my brain was trained from like a very early age.
What, and maybe around the Catholic thing specifically, like, are you guys going to mass every week? And Jesuit, Jesuit background, or what kind of Catholicism?
No, we were Irish Roman Catholic family, so like we went to mass every Sunday, and like miraculously, like all 10 of us would file in and like be quiet for an hour and a half, which I have no idea how my parents got that to work, because I've only got 2, and I can't make them shut up for more than 5 minutes. We were driving home from my brother-in-law's house last night, and I was playing this game, a very original game called Let's See Who Can Be Quiet for the Longest. And literally, like my 3-year-old, I mean, she can't go 30 seconds without blabbering. So I don't know how my parents did it back then, but I mean, yeah, very, very traditional Catholic upbringing, and yeah, went to a Jesuit high school in the city, and which weirdly then, during my sort of high school years was when I think I was going through my own sort of like confused period of like trying to find out who am I and why am I here, and all those confusing things that every teenager goes through to some degree. But the Jesuits are interesting because they're very education focused, and they're also hyper open-minded about things. Like the way they would teach about the Bible is that the Bible is a book to be read like a library. It's not something that's read to be a literal, historical text of what actually occurred necessarily. It's a series of stories that you can take lessons from and pick and choose. You shouldn't read it literally and things like that. And I took a course probably my sophomore year called the Science of Theology, and that course was taught by a Jesuit, and the whole point of it was basically trying to reconcile science with theology, and because there's obviously so many contradictions in a lot of it. And that was another thing that I went through this phase of like, I mean, gosh, I spent the first 15 years of my life praying every day and being hyper religious, to then I get to high school and I start learning science and things like that, and sort of the inconsistencies with religion. And then I kind of, in a weird way, I moved almost to like pivoted to like, shunning religion to some degree. I wouldn't say I became like atheist, but I became like much more agnostic and like, trying to like decipher like, all right, how relevant is, theology and especially monotheism and things like that in my life, and trying to reconcile that with like the way that science works and the way the universe works and things like that. And a lot of this is all just sort of a process of me trying to figure out, how does the world work? And like a lot of people know that from my, my finance work, that, a lot of my thinking is sort of pinned in, how do things work at more of an operational level? And I was going through that whole confused process of trying to reconcile all that as a teenager, and, at the same time, going through all the same issues that every teenager does. It was my teenage years were bad, in the sense that I was just really sort of lost and confused, I think. And I didn't deal with it well in a lot of ways. Like I did a lot of the things that probably a lot of teenage boys do, where, I kind of reverted to like sort of like barbarian mentality of like, I need to be manly man. And, I tried to play high school football, was terrible at that. I tried to be the rah-rah guy in high school, and, in retrospect was probably just kind of a jerk, which all stemmed from like an insecurity of like not knowing who I was and trying to go through this process of figuring out who am I and what am I becoming and what should I try to become. And so it was a weird period for me in life, because that was the period where so much of, especially with my strict religious background, sort of came in conflict with like, okay, who am I becoming, and how does this reconcile itself with what I want to be in the future?
Does that get felt? Do you feel that at all? Did you feel it at all at the time on the family level? Did all the siblings go to the same Jesuit high school in the city?
No, because it was all boys school. So, the girls obviously couldn't go there. So, the boys all went there. And then all three of the older boys went to Georgetown eventually. So, which is also a Jesuit school for those who don't know, but it doesn't have the same, Georgetown doesn't have the same sort of like strict Jesuit underpinnings that like my high school did. I mean, the priests taught half the classes in my high school, whereas at Georgetown, I think I maybe had one Jesuit priest the whole time I was there. So they're not as like in your face and influential. So my Georgetown experience was very different, in large part because of that, but also for other reasons, because I met my wife early on at Georgetown, and that was like the most transformational process I ever went through.
Before the wife story, so is Georgetown just the predestined track in the family? Like, this is where you're going to college, this is the best school you have access to in the area. Why Georgetown?
It was the best school nearby. I think my parents just didn't want us to go far away. So, and I was the one probably always most at risk of going far away because I was always sort of the most, I think, adventurous and sort of open-minded of the bunch. And so, like, I applied to a lot of West Coast schools, and but Georgetown was the best school that I got into. So it was a no-brainer. And obviously, I had an older brother there at the time, so like I kind of got to float through freshman year of college with an older brother who was a senior at the time, and it's nice to have a sibling at college because especially for me, like I think transferring from high school years where I was very confused and then starting to sort of find myself early in college, I was still though trying to find my footing, and my first half of freshman year was a wrecking ball. Like, it's almost amazing that I even graduated when I think back on just, how wrapped up in like the party scene I was. And I was like, I'd gone 4 years without having a girl in the same class. So I was like all of a sudden like surrounded by women, and I was like, whoa. I was way over my skis with that one.
Do you have a major right away when you show up at Georgetown? Does it take a little while?
Did I have a what?
A major. Did you know what you're going to do?
Yeah, so I majored so it was interesting. I originally majored in marketing because I kind of was like, I want to do something creative. I want to, use this sort of outside the box thinking and ability to do something more creative. And marketing just seemed, I don't know, like I was in the business school. So that seemed like the logical path within business to sort of focus on. And, it's weird in retrospect to think like I would have probably loved like doing, media and advertising or something like that. So the end of my freshman year, I'm at my oldest brother's graduation, and, I'm talking to my uncle, and we're talking about my major because I had started to focus on marketing, but I'm trying to remember. I think you pick your major early sophomore year or something like that. And so I hadn't officially picked my major yet. And my uncle was basically like, he was a New Yorker. He was like, you gotta go into finance and investing. It's like a no-brainer. That's where all the money is. How are you going to make any money in marketing and advertising? That's not the way to become successful. And so, I pivoted. I became a finance and econ major, and I was thinking like, at that point it was interesting because I was like, I just want to get filthy rich, right? Not knowing anything about anything, which is weird now because now my whole mentality around all that is like almost not necessarily the opposite, but like to me I'm still sort of on this exploratory path of figuring out how does the world work? How does the financial system work? And finance is so awesome in part because the financial system changes every day. There's always new stuff, like the whole crypto ecosystem, I'm like, in the last 10 years just came out of nowhere. And I'm like, how does this stuff work? What is Bitcoin? What are all these coins? What is this thing? So this system is always evolving and changing, and I'm constantly finding myself trying to keep up to date with it and understand it and explain it to people. And so it's like this never-ending path of, exploring and learning and understanding. And I find myself less interested in the make a lot of money part and just perpetually more interested in the how does this work part and how can I help people understand how does this work part.
New York uncle with the advice. What business was he in? I don't want to out him completely, but I'm just curious, like, what's the background that he gave you this advice on?
He was a real estate guy, so he was kind of adjacent to, not a real estate investor, but worked for a big, important real estate firm. And
so he saw who was buying and selling the things that he was.
Yeah, he
brokering
knew
or
who
offering.
owned stuff and understood. I mean, he worked in Manhattan and, he was a Connecticut guy who left Connecticut every morning and went into Manhattan, and he was a real Manhattan finance guy. And I was, especially at the time, sort of the fraudulent DC, finance person. And he kind of helped steer me more towards being like a truer finance person. But he understood the underpinnings of how like the epicenter of the financial world really worked.
Did anybody else in your family weigh in on it, either siblings or parents? Did anybody say like, marketing's really great for you, Cullen, or this whole business and economics thing, that's you? Did you get feedback from family on this stuff?
I didn't really. There's a lot of lawyers in my family.
Okay.
So a lot of us followed the path of dad, basically, and, saw that in the way that dad had played out so successfully. And I think just said, okay, hey, that seems like a good model to follow, which is kind of weird in retrospect, because I think that, especially early on in college, I sort of had this vision in the back of my mind that I would just step into my father's role. Like, oh, I'm the more entrepreneurial one. I'll take over dad's law business because he was an entrepreneur too, and I'll just step into his shoes. And so it is kind of interesting that I ended up choosing a profession very outside of like the family profession, which again, I think was just sort of my proclivity for outside the box thinking and, exploring these other sort of options that, may or may not have been interesting. But I always found the money system so fascinating, because it was like, especially like studying economics in undergrad, it was always interesting to me that economics is something that people don't agree on. Like, there's so many different schools and philosophies, and economics is obviously it's part hard science. There are certain laws and truths and basic underpinnings, but there's also a lot of, behavioral finance involved in all of it. It's, an economist is part hard science and part soft science. They're part like psychologist and part scientist, which is a really weird world. Like, a lot of people don't understand why economists can get so much wrong at times. It's because, it's like a good analogy for understanding economics is that it's like trying to understand how a car operates, but then also having to understand that there is an insane person operating that vehicle. And so there might be certain truths about how that vehicle can operate. It might be able to go a certain speed and do certain things by pressing this button or that button. But the crazy person will press those buttons in different ways and make it go different speeds based on just how they perceive things and how they think about the world. And that's the crazy thing about economics that's so interesting, that I think sort of drew me to it, that it is this sort of almost unsolvable puzzle. And for me, that was just, I was like lured to it because I think that I was attracted to trying to solve that puzzle and trying to figure out, how does this thing work, and can you explain it in a way where, regardless of how crazy the driver is, can you understand the parameters of how this thing operates so that you can help people then decipher the potential outcomes based on a fundamental understanding of how it all works. So I was always drawn to just how the financial markets work and the economy works, just because it's an unsolvable puzzle, and it still is. I mean, I don't know if I've solved. It's weird, as you get older, all you kind of keep learning is that you know less than you thought you did. Like I would have said back in, after the financial crisis, and I wrote Understanding the Modern Monetary System, which is a popular paper I wrote. And then I wrote my book in 2014, Pragmatic Capitalism, which goes into, more in depth about how the financial system and economy works. And, I would have said back then, like, I kind of feel like I solved like, 75% of all this stuff. And now I'm like, no, you didn't, you dumbass. Like you barely scratched the surface on how all this stuff works. And the last 10 years, and especially COVID, just proved all that to be true.
It's funny how these things. So now, speaking of unsolvable puzzles, in college you meet your wife. What's that story? How's that happen?
So my wife is a California girl who transfers from UCLA after her sophomore year. And I had my freshman year, so I'd had some academic troubles my freshman year, and I had to make up time. And so I took summer school classes after my freshman year. And part of that was I worked at a law firm as a mailboy, and big DC law firm. And I met this girl there who went to school at George Mason. And it ended up that we kind of, we remained friends, and we talked over the years. And after sophomore year, she transfers to Georgetown from George Mason, and her best friend is this girl from California who transferred from UCLA. So they were in like the same transfer pool basically. And I was entrenched obviously in like the scene at Georgetown. And so this girl kind of like clung on to me to start meeting people. And, I invited her to a party, and the very first night, this is before the school year had even started, we're going to a party. I invite her, and it's funny because my roommate then, we meet the two of them before we meet anybody else, and they come over for like a drink or something. And my roommate he says to me, he's like, you are 100% going to date this girl at some point this year. I guarantee it. And I was like, whatever. She's way out of my league. California girl. Like she's not going to go for like some bum from DC. And so lo and behold, I mean, within like 2 months, we're dating, and she's interesting because she kind of came with the same mentality of like very sort of different perspectives. Everything was, a California perspective, which I didn't know anything about California at the time. It was like, California to me was like a foreign country.
Where in California is she from?
San Francisco.
Okay.
So she was from Novato, like kind of like Marin County, San Francisco. But she'd been at, UCLA, so Southern California for a few years. And, but this girl was whip smart. I mean, the type of person that I would study with, and, we'd have a test if we were both in the business school. So, if we were in the same class, like she was the annoying type that, we're going to a party that night, and on Monday we've got an exam in the same class. She'll cram for it for an hour before we go out to the party, and I'll cram for an hour and feel like I barely got through it, and then the next day have to like catch up and do like 3 more hours of cramming to figure out what's going on, and she's like hungover in bed. And it's like the world is unfair. There's people who are just a lot smarter than other people. But the great thing about her was that I met her still in sort of this period of like transition where I was still trying to figure out, who am I? And it was something that, at least for me, I kind of knew I was punching up dating her. And so I was always in the back of my mind, I think, trying to be someone better than I really was. And I kind of knew that at the time. And it always sort of pushed me to want to be somebody better, just because I wanted to level up to her over time. And, I don't know if I ever achieved that. I won't tell her that, but it transformed me in the way that my whole life played out, just because I I think I took this risk trying to like chase somebody who was sort of out of my league and then prove I've spent the last 25 years sort of trying to like prove myself to her and just become a little bit better in every way where I could justify her being with me to some degree.
I want to pull on this thread with this too, though, because it also feels like if you guys are studying together, if you're in the same school, that doesn't survive a friendship at that point in life too. So there had to be like a special mechanism of like really being very close, if not best friends, pretty much out the gate with this stuff too. I get that sense.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
I would say that's the thing that made it work was that we've just always had a great time together.
Yeah.
Like I think a lot of people, not that I'm here to give like relationship advice, but I think a lot of people get involved in relationships where they're
please give
they're either just attracted to somebody or, there's certain aspects of them that they like, but maybe they're not like best friends. And we were best friends first. It just so happened that, she is attractive and, all that stuff. But like, it was much more so that I really, really liked being around her. Like we would just have a great time. We would, whether we were, partying or just, hanging out, we made each other laugh and we just enjoyed each other's company. And that was the thing that I think has always been the most important aspect of our relationship is that, when you're going to marry somebody, I mean, you've got to recognize that you're going to spend an insane amount of time with this person. You're going to eat, tens of thousands of meals with this person, and you're going to, have kids and be linked to this person in a way that makes you inseparable. And if you don't like being with that person in like the most basic ways, just sitting around watching TV or, having meals, things like that, it just makes everything a lot crummier. So having that sort of underpinning where we were just really good friends, that's always been something that even during, like all relationships, I mean, we've had times where like we probably looked at each other and we were like, I fucking hate you. And that's natural. I mean, we've been together for 25 years now. So it's, that's a long time. And if you don't have that sort of like baseline likability for each other, it's just hard.
What's the end of school like? Do you both know the path right when you're graduating? What's the feeling?
No, it was weird because we graduated early 2000s and like the economy still rocky, still kind of coming out of the tech bust. And, my grades weren't like her grades. I mean, she graduated like summa cum laude and all that stuff. And, her resume just looked like a joke. Like she'd done like an investment banking internship the summer before senior year and stuff like that. And, with like a big DC investment bank. And, I don't know what I'd done. I think I was waiting tables at like an Italian restaurant, probably. That was like my big senior year job, which, had its own benefits for me. Actually, I would say one of the best jobs I probably ever had was waiting tables, just because it taught me to, sort of appreciate the services industry. And also that was kind of the first time where I was put in like a really uncomfortable position of being face to face with strangers and, being forced to serve people in a way that I wasn't really accustomed to. So, this is a totally random story, but I always love this story because every time I think about this restaurant, I think about this story. It was a bartender at this restaurant, and he was a weird dude, but he was definitely, he did not like working at this place. He was an older guy, but he wasn't a sommelier, but he was like the wine guy at the restaurant. And so when a bottle of wine came out, if it was a nicer one, he would oftentimes come out and present it. And I came in one day and it was like 3:00, and this guy, he was, at his wit's end with this restaurant. He hated the manager. Him and the manager would like fight in the back kitchen like all the time, and like I mean near like fisticuffs, and the I walk in one day, it's like 3 o'clock. I had just gotten out of class probably, and I walk in, I'm about to start like a night shift, and this guy, I see the bartender walking out, and he's about to serve a bottle of wine. He walks up, and I couldn't hear everything that was going on, and I saw this from like the distance, but he took the bottle of wine out, presents it very nicely, the typical thing. He starts to open it, and he breaks the bottle on the edge of the table. The neck pops off, and he just, half the wine pours on the table, and he puts the wine bottle, right on the table. He takes his apron off, he throws it on the ground, and he walks out of the restaurant. I was like, whoa, I guess Billy just quit. But I always think about that when I think of like, that restaurant, and like, God, the coolest way to quit a job is to just present a bottle of wine to somebody who you probably hate and just crack the neck on the table and put it on the table and walk out of there.
You remember that when you want to leave financial services.
Oh,
what?
Yeah.
Is this like, so I'm guessing not a chain restaurant, maybe like what, paint a little more of a picture of this experience. What kind of a restaurant was this besides just an Italian restaurant? And you were just a waiter the whole time?
I don't know if it was a chain. It was called Paparazzi. It was right on like M Street there in Wisconsin, right in the middle of Georgetown, and it's no longer there. It used to be, I think it was pretty popular. I mean, we were bustling on the weekends and stuff. I would make like, back then I was making like $100 a night, which was, felt like a fortune. But it was a cool spot. It was like I don't want to say traditional Italian restaurant, but like a legit good Italian restaurant. Like I felt like a fancy waiter waiting at this restaurant. But yeah, I mostly just sat in the back and snacked on like the breadsticks and
that's part of your job at that age.
Bruschetta.
Hell yeah. What?
That's where I have recently gotten obsessed with baking breads and stuff, and my love of bruschetta comes from that restaurant where I've always tried to like recreate the bread that they had at this place because it was so good. They'd serve these big steaming hot loaves of bread with breadsticks. It was like the best thing ever. I'm like a kind of like a carb lover, so I have this like love-hate relationship with carbohydrates, but I loved all the food at that restaurant. It was so good.
So who's like, is it a man? How are you learning the customer service reality of like what it means to be in service to people coming in this restaurant? Is it just impressed on you by like osmosis in the room? Like, oh crap, this is how I act? Or is somebody training you in this art?
Yeah, I mean, this is another thing. I had trouble conforming to like having a boss, and that's kind of been a story of my whole career. But I got in trouble one evening because like I think the manager overheard me. Somebody asked me, oh, how is the special? And I remember saying like, oh, I don't really like it. It's, we tried it because we would go in and try all the specials beforehand, and they would tell us like the pitch to like sell this to people. And I've never been good at sales, and I've always tried to be just brutally honest with people. I don't have great taste in food, so that's probably a problem, being a waiter. But this person asked me, how's the seafood special tonight? And I was like, it's garbage. And the manager overheard me, and like 20 minutes later, they brought me back. He hauled me in the back to the chef. He tells the whole story, and the chef was like livid. I mean, they were close to firing me, I think, on the spot. And so I had a little bit of trouble just like conforming to like a sales pitch and, selling things, especially selling. I've always had a huge problem selling things that I didn't believe in. And this was the truest part of like the first job I had out of college was selling life insurance because my wife is getting offers at that time from like Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers and every great big investment bank. And these are jobs in Manhattan where she's going to go move up to New York and I'm going to stay in DC and sell life insurance. And I mean, my first job, out of college was a disaster. Just like it was 50 guys in a boiler room with the white pages, and the white pages, for kids who don't know, or was an old book that had the literal name and phone number of everybody in your area. And we would just go through and we were just dialing for digits, and that was it. We were making, like, my boss would have a target of, like, I can't remember, it was like 1,000 calls a day or something. You're just working from 9 to 7 every day or something, making phone calls and selling life insurance. And you'll never forget, like, I would study the life insurance products, and I would study, like, we had this one whole life insurance product that, like, we had a sales pitch about, and I would go home in the evening and, like, actually study it and, like, start, like, running numbers on it. And I remember I went into my boss's office one day and I was like, Terry, this thing doesn't do what we claim it does. Like, this is what it actually does, and this is what we claim it does. And I wrote this all out for him, and I was like, I think we should try to, sell it doing this. And he was like, he took the piece of paper, he crumpled it up, he throws it in the garbage can. He's like, your job is to sell the product the way we want you to sell the product, not to analyze the products. You're not a product analyst. And so I didn't last very long at that job, that was a kind of another consistency with me over my career, was that I had trouble falling in line with, like, other people's, sales pitches, and just, I would look at, like, the way things were being done and say, either, overanalyzing it, or just looking at it and say, like, well, maybe we should try to do it this way, or, so I had a lot of trouble working on a team of people with, like, an established sales process, where I was always trying to sort of interject with my own, immature opinions about the way they should, like, do everything. These guys, all successful people who've been doing everything for years and years, and, I'm coming in as, like, a college grad with opinions, big opinions, thinking he knows everything about everything, and telling these people that they should, like, transform, their whole business model based on what my opinion was.
Where in the country are you and your wife to be at this point when you're going through this stuff?
So we're still in DC at this point. So we kind of went through a phase where we were sort of trying to figure out, like, okay, does she move to New York? And I'm going to stay in DC. And we went through, like, that whole, like, if you've seen the movie Family Man, like, there's a kind of, like, two different alternative realities in the movie. And it's the Nick Cage movie where he, in one alternate reality, goes and becomes, like, a Wall Street bigwig. He's like a, investment banker or something. And in the alternate reality, he's like a tire salesman at, like, the family business. And we very much went through that whole process where we were like, but the kicker with that movie is that he breaks up with his wife to go to New York. And we very much went through that same exact thought process where we were like, okay, do we break up and you go, take the job at Goldman Sachs, and, go get filthy rich, but work like a dog and all that? Or do we stay together and see if we can make something work and just see where, this love affair takes us instead? And we chose, the path that, where we stayed together, and we stayed in DC for 2 years. And we eventually, I'm in San Diego, California now, and almost 100% because she wanted to move back to California. And I'd never like taken a leap of faith like that. And I'd never left DC. And, so in 2006-ish, I guess it is, we uprooted and we drove cross country. We spent 3 weeks driving cross country, and I, like, uprooted my whole career and everything. And she quit her job, and we just were like, F it. Let's go do something adventurous. Now's the time to do it. And we'll go live in San Diego, California. We had another Georgetown friend who had been living at the beach in, a little community in southern San Diego called Pacific Beach, where we went out there in March of, like, 2005 and visited him. And, DC weather then in March is like hit or miss. You could get a blizzard, but you're probably getting cold rain at a minimum all the time or most of the time. And we fly out to San Diego and visit this guy, and we were 24-ish at the time or whatever, early 20s, mid 20s, and we were drunk on the beach for a week. And I was like, we got back to DC, got off the plane, and it was cold and rainy, and I was like, what are we doing with our lives?
There are no fish tacos here.
Yeah, what? I didn't even know what a fish taco was. I was like, or probably didn't even know what a burrito was back then. I mean,
simpler times.
So one of my favorite, I got to tell this story because my wife, she tells it every time. So one of the reasons why I've become more of like a foodie in the last like 5 years or so is because I think my Irish upbringing resulted in me having virtually no taste in food.
Exactly.
Like I didn't even know, like, people were like, would you like asparagus? I'm like, asparo what? Like, like what? I know green things. I know broccoli. I know corn. That's pretty much it. I know what a steak looks like, like a well done, like crappy steak. I know what that tastes like. But aside from that, like I had like no understanding of anything food related. And so my wife was always talking about this stuff called sushi from California, and how her favorite food is sushi. I love sushi. And I had no idea. And this is embarrassing because I'm 20 years old at the time. I probably should have known what sushi was at that point in my life, I feel like. And so one night, like I'm trying to impress her, and I go to this supermarket and I buy fresh sushi, and I take it back home. I throw it in the freezer because I'm like, this is fish. Like
raw
you gotta,
fish. I gotta keep
it's
it.
raw fish. You gotta freeze this, right? And so I throw it in the freezer. She comes over at whatever, like 6 o'clock, and I threw it in the microwave. I was like, you gotta thaw this. Obviously, it's frozen. Now you have to thaw it. This is how you cook food, right? You thaw it out in the microwave. And I brought it out, and it's steaming hot, and she looks at it and she laughed for like
30 years.
I mean 30 minutes.
30
years.
She's still laughing today.
She still tells this story about like, I mean, it's so embarrassing in retrospect, but I know how sushi works now. So now I only microwave it for 5 seconds.
Yeah, that's smart. Like a Krispy Kreme donut, the way you're genetically built. All right, so the move to California happens early 2000s. Like, how many jobs deep are you at this point? You've sold life insurance. What else have you done by the time
I had quit? So I quit my job at Merrill Lynch. I had sort of lucked into a job at Merrill, which at the time was weird because like, at that point I'm going through like, I probably had like just read, after quitting the life insurance job, I knew a guy who worked at Merrill Lynch who had worked originally at the life insurance firm I was at. And so he kind of like put in a good word and, whatever, said I had a good background, blah, blah, blah. And kind of I got a leg in the door. And luckily there was a team that worked in Alexandria, Virginia they were 3 or 4 people at the time, but they had back then, they had a $500 million book, which back then was big. But they basically had like neglected like the bottom like 200 million because it was smaller, probably like kind of crummier accounts. Just these guys were overwhelmed with the big accounts, so they didn't really have time for the the bottom 20 or bottom like 200 million of it. So they wanted like some young guy to just come in and like hammer the phones, and that's all I'd been doing for the last like 6 months or whatever. So, and I'd probably like just read like reminiscences of a stock operator, and I was like, yes, stockbroker. This is my dream job. This is exactly what I want to be doing. I'm in finance now. I'm going to be slinging stocks and bonds. And we were doing like old school stock picking. We were getting I was getting the morning research reports from David Rosenberg and Bernstein. And I was like, it was buy, sell, this and that. And I loved it. I was so into that stuff. But we were really, again, like still just like, we were slinging stocks and bonds, and we would get like an email in the morning where, Merck had been downgraded from a buy to a sell because of an FDA, disapproval or something like that. And, we would go into every client account and just call people up, and we would just sell their Merck and ring up, whatever, tens of thousands of dollars of commission. And, the more and more I get into that, I do that I was only at Merrill for, I don't know, less than 2 years or something. But the more and more I did it, the more and more I was like, man, this commission-based stuff does not seem like a good way to be treating our customers.
Seafood special all over again.
Yeah. So, and again, I'm like, as I'm getting more and more into this, I am getting really into understanding actually how this stuff works. And we would sell like a lot of like A share and C share mutual funds back then, and kind of a lot of the same names that are still around, amazingly. But at the same time, around then was when the first ETFs were becoming really popular. And I'm looking at all these things, and the fees are so much lower. And I'm starting to do like real data analysis on this. I'm doing, the overlays of like SPY versus like, A, B, C, D, E, F, G mutual fund. And, I'm looking at the overlays and I'm like, these things do the exact same thing, except this one costs 100 basis points or 1%, and this one costs 0.1%. And I'm like, well, this seems like a no-brainer. Like this one's better for the customer. And, again, like I go into my boss's office and, present this evidence, and and he's like, you get paid to sell this one, you do not get paid to sell this one. So you can sell that one if you want, but you will not have a job here in a year. So, do whatever you want. And, my boss at Merrill was super cool. He was a really awesome guy. And, but I just, again, like I was having trouble, like, conforming to the ethos of the sales practices team and, kind of, I think, pushing back against the conventional wisdom of the time and the way these big firms operated. And I got to a point where, especially after I had like a few friends and family who were clients of mine, I was like, I just don't really feel comfortable doing this. And I mean, I started my own RIA, I think back in like my first one back in like 2005. So I like to think I was sort of ahead of the game in terms of like adopting ETFs and, starting the independent RIA process and things like that. But then we moved to California, and I basically was like a beach bum for, like 4 or 5 years, and the financial crisis happens. And that was its own whole level of upheaval. I'd left with a handful of my clients from Merrill Lynch, so I was kind of doing my own thing, figuring it out. Probably not doing it that well. Certainly not doing it at any sort of like comprehensive planning process that like you and I are both used to now. But still, like, entrepreneurial and trying to eat what I kill to some degree. But also, I was at a point where around then, I was very much in the mode of like, I want to be young and have fun. And I very specifically chose not to do the New York thing. Like I had tons of friends at the time they had moved to Manhattan, and they were working, 100-hour weeks, and they were making, back then they were making $200,000. I was like, I'm probably a beach bum making, I don't know, $50,000, or something. But I was living at the beach, and I was drinking, $1 beers every night, and, eating, dinner for $2. And I was living at the beach, and I was like, we had transitioned from our apartment in DC after we graduated was like 600 square feet. And I think back then it was like $1,200. And we moved to an apartment, a 2-bedroom apartment, 2 blocks from the beach in San Diego. And it was $1,200. I was like, I just arbitraged my whole life. Like, this is insane. So at the time, in retrospect, I do kind of sometimes think back, and I'm like, what if I'd spent those like 5-10 years like really grinding and like, doing the New York thing? Like, how much further along would my career be now versus where I am? But at the same time, I'm always like, no, I had more fun those 5 to 10 years than I ever did.
Nick Cage has something to teach you about that if you ever want to go back and rewatch that. What's your wife doing? Is she beach bumming it with you, or is she doing something else?
Yes, well, she was, but she also, like she does, she got, like a great job at a consulting firm in San Diego that was kind of like high end, and she's doing this was like a forensic accounting firm that did like basically like expert witness testimony for big lawsuits. And like, so she kind of like transformed into like kind of like this forensic accounting world, and like, basically doing like damages expertise for big lawsuits. And like, she's still doing that to this day. I laugh at like the all the stuff going on with like Doge and stuff, because I'm like, why is Elon Musk and a bunch of 20-year-olds the ones doing this, when we know that there are people who do forensic accounting and like damages analysis, whether it's government damages analysis or big corporate damages analysis, who all these people do is, these people are CPAs and PhDs, and, their whole background is in like forensic accounting and like getting into balance sheets and cash flows and stuff like that, and understanding, my wife can probably look at it like an income statement and identify inconsistencies in like, 5 minutes.
Right. Intuition.
So, but at the same time, she's doing, all that stuff. So she's sort of, the way our tag team has always sort of worked is that, I've always been the one who I took the big risks, trying to, I guess, sort of, shoot the moon to a little more degree. And she's the one that always just had like the really nice, high paying job that, she never, she's kind of a superstar in the sense that like she's never had to like work like the investment banking hours, but always kind of was able to like make pretty close to like investment banking money, just because she's that sort of smart.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to like think about the way that our relationship has worked financially in this very like cohesive way, where we've had careers that are adjacent to some degree, but also like in terms of like the way we're taking risks have been very different over time. Because and I've to some degree went from like, leapfrogged from like, failure to success to failure to, kind of, there's been a lot of feast or famine in my career, where I've gone through these periods, like I said, during the financial crisis, where I probably made no money in 2009 because I kind of just shut everything down. And then, but then pragmatic capitalism like takes off in 2009 or towards the end of 2009 in a way where 2010 to 2015, I'm kind of making, at least for me, what was an insane amount of money for writing a blog. And that also had this big multiplier effect, where I was able to take the blog audience and basically turn it into a book deal, which to me, I was like, was the craziest thing that happened to me, because, I'm all of a sudden, I've got the ear of Palgrave Macmillan, who's like a big 5 publisher, and they're like, how would you like X dollars to write a book for us? And I was like, the joke's on you. I don't know how I would ever be qualified to write a book, but if you're going to give me a big pile of money to spend the next 6 months just writing a book, you bet your ass I will do that.
I've done that work before. I can sit down and
so, and anyway, I don't know. I have a somewhat conversational way of writing that I think, at least in the finance world, I think is a lot more relatable. I don't write, especially when I write research and stuff, I don't write in a very sort of academic way. Most econ or even finance papers that you read they're dense. Almost every finance book out there is sort of dense. And I always approached all this in a much more approachable way, which, I don't know, it's ironic that I say that about Pragmatic Capitalism, because that book is anything but like, approachable, I don't think, in a lot of ways. It's, there are pieces of that are very sort of academic, but to me, my book, that first book was interesting because I wrote it in a way where I very intentionally was trying to, like, I think, validate myself, because I still was going, here I am still at that point in my career and life, trying to validate myself and find out, who am I still? Where am I going? And that book for me was something that I wrote in a very intentional way where, I didn't have a CFP or a CFA or anything like that. I'd never gotten the credentials to be validated by my peers. And so that book to me in a lot of ways was, I think, me trying to validate myself and, put my knowledge out there in a way where I could say or try to prove to other people, like, hey, like, I kind of know what I'm talking about with a lot of this stuff.
I want to hit a couple of things before we run out of time and I make you go through these notes with me. Where along the line do you guys get married? When do you put a ring on it, Cullen?
Oh, well, that's an interesting story because we are not officially married.
Breaking news, I'm sure.
So,
this I didn't know. I didn't tee up for this, but now that's an interesting story.
It's a weird one. I think, for a long time it was part financial strategy that, we could keep things kind of independent, but, again, kind of non-conformity to just, universal beliefs and stuff. We never felt like we needed to validate our relationship through this, like, public ceremony or something. And so, for whatever reason, we just never felt like that was the thing that was going to, like, put a stamp on, like, our relationship. We just always said, our relationship is validated by the way, we are together and the way that we treat each other. And, if that doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. Nothing, no stamp of approval from the government is going to change that outcome. So I suspect at some point, we've got 2 kids together, and there are obvious legal reasons to need to do something like that. I have a feeling at some point we'll do some sort of, like, big throwdown and big party and probably put a stamp of approval on it. But yeah, that's something that I don't always tell everybody that, But it's funny because, like, I always laugh at my buddies because, like, my buddies will be like, especially people that know me from college and stuff, they'll be like, Cullen, your girlfriend, they say it jokingly because they know, like, and I always push back. I'm like, F you, like, I'm 10 times more married than you are. Like, you know Erica as well as I do, and you know that everything that I'm going through, that you're going through with your wife is, I've been going through that for 10 years before you ever went through it with your wife. So, don't get it confused that I'm not married in the sense that I've got all the same, married problems that every married man does. So,
well, I'm going to have you back for a second part of this, and we're going to get more into, like, the pragmatic capitalist and the book transition and what we scratched. But so I don't keep you here for like 6 hours, because I can clearly see that this is the way this would go, because the amount of unchecked notes I have on just the restaurant chapter alone. Let me know when you're writing that book. I'm ready for that book. I got notes. I'm going to invite you to freely respond to these as we go back. And I'm deliberately cutting where we're cutting in the story, because I just think even that last point about the relationship status and what Facebook wants you to label it, but what your actions do. There's a bunch of through lines here we got to explore. Back at the beginning of this conversation, you made the comment about feeling, you said this again at the end, feeling fraudulent, feeling undeserved, all the stuff of, like, not having the CFA, not having the CFP. And this is, like, back at the very beginning, I'm asking you about all the accomplishments and the things that the praise people were throwing on you at a young age. Do you feel like you could have talked or written the way you talked if you had those credentials, though?
No, I think that's part of it, is that because I didn't go through that sort of, like, more formalized process, there's a level of indoctrination in, especially I think in economic circles, where if you go to, I'm not I'm certainly not bashing anyone who has ever gone through these processes, but I think it's just the process you go through. If you go to, the Chicago School of Business and you were a, undergrad, learning from Gene Fama or, Milton Friedman or whoever it was, like you learned a certain process and way of thinking about the world. And I think because of the way you're trained, you come out of that just, I think, a little bit biased towards thinking in a very particular way. And, this is true of going through, any sort of, if you'd worked at, any big financial firm, if you worked at a big hedge fund that focused on stock picking strategies and, the strategy worked for a long time, you're going to come out of that and you're going to be convinced that, stock picking, I know it gets a lot of criticism, but no, stock picking works. And my firm that I've spun off, we do stock picking because I know that this can work. And, you get sort of molded by experience. And that's so true of all the big processes that teach people how to learn about, the way the economy works or the way the financial world works. And me having never really gone through that formalized process, I think forced me to some degree I was constantly, to this day, I reach out to, so many different people about different things about the way the world works. And I've changed my mind about a lot of things in large part because I was never married to any specific concept. And so I think that's been, obviously in some ways, like not having that, that formalized background and especially like the peer group that you can fall back on with that. Like, God, I look at guys in our industry like, people like Wes Gray who, went to the Chicago school and, they were taught by Gene Fama and, are influenced by Cliff Asness and these like giants of our industry. And somebody like that can always fall back on these giants. And, whether it's for confirmation or just like networking experience. And that's so much of like a lot of the career arc that we all experience is like, who do you align yourself with over time? Who is your network? And, I probably haven't always done myself a lot of favors in that I've never picked a pack and then just sort of run with that pack. In a lot of ways, I've always been a little bit of like a lone wolf where I'm kind of just out there, sometimes running with a pack and helping them. But then, halfway through the meal being finished, I'm kind of like, you know what? I kind of am hungry for something different. And, I don't know. It served me well in a lot of ways. It probably has served me poorly in other ways. But I've just never been married to like a specific, process and school of thought because I don't think that there is any specific school of thought that just always works all the time. So I've always kept a little bit of distance just because I've always been a little hesitant to be married to something that I feel like, hey, that thing may not work in 10 years or whatever.
What do you think having such a big family, having that type of community around you in the house and at school and just the sheer chaos your parents are managing, what do you think that taught you about being able to swap strategies mentally in life, but also having those relationships with your siblings are just always there?
Yeah, that's a great transition because that's probably part of why I've always felt comfortable, kind of never having to align myself professionally because I always could fall back on this bedrock foundation that I had in my family. Like we're kind of a little bit of a weird family. My parents are still together and the 8 of us are really close. Like we did a big family Zoom call yesterday and almost everybody gets on it. And so I've always had that to fall back on, which probably has given me a lot of comfort in taking risks that I wouldn't have otherwise taken because I've always kind of known that, hey, if I fail or I get pushed away from this group, like it doesn't matter because I've got the group that matters the most and they're always going to be there for me no matter, if I'm a failure or I'm a success or whatever. So that probably in a lot of ways, like my parents really instilled that in us that we needed to be tight, we needed to be loyal. Loyalty was always a thing that really, like it's the thing that I won't get into details, but I've experienced at the family level some disloyalty and man, there's some sort of mob mentality that comes out of those situations where you're like, somebody did my family wrong and I might have to do whatever it takes to get payback. But that's the kind of family that my parents built us to be, was that their loyalty has always been just the top of the pyramid in terms of like, this is the number one thing that's most important in the way we treat each other. And that's filtered through my entire life and career because I've always known that my family's going to be loyal to me no matter what I do in my career and where it goes.
This idea of unsolvable puzzles, the car with the crazy driver as the economic thing, and just I feel like there's a connection between understanding that there's unsolvable puzzles stacked on unsolvable puzzle. That's one of the things that maybe helps give you that freedom. Like really knowing that gives you the freedom to not just get obsessed with only using and applying one model to the world.
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, the economy it doesn't have that sort of, I think, foundational consistency that you can find in something like family. So you have the freedom to be exploratory in a way that in terms of understanding it, that allows you to I think deviate from those foundational principles that we want to have. So it's weird. I mean, you're over the course of life, it's so interesting, especially getting older. I mean, you start to really recognize that like, having good friends and family really are like two of the most important things in the world, because those are the people that just have always been with you through the whole ride. And, although the economy and the financial markets evolve and the everything around us appears to be evolving, there's always these like constants. And the constant for me has always been the family aspect of it. And so it's, it's weird, even with we have some crazy drivers in our family, but, there's still, constants in the sense that like, hey, there's still core parts of like all the people riding in the same vehicle through this whole big ride.
If you as Nick Cage, you go down the marketing path, if you'd gone down the marketing path all the way, you never changed the majors, you never listened to New York Uncle, do you think you would have been able to sell something you didn't entirely believe in? You feel like you ever could have learned that skill, or is that just totally against your DNA where you would have broken?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that underneath there's like that Catholic boy who, I was an altar boy when I was little. I mean, it was trying to be honest and loyal, I think, and that's part of like the stuff that my dad would beat into us was, those were the sort of foundational principles of having good character and, having integrity and, being a good person. And so I don't know. I think at its core, I don't really think I ever could have gotten into the mode of selling something that I just, didn't really believe in, because it would have made me feel like I was like doing myself a disservice, because I knew I was trying to force something on somebody that they either didn't want or they just didn't need. So I think I was always going to be bad at sales. Like gosh, if I have something that I really believe in, like I won't sell it to you in the traditional sort of salesy way, but I'll try to explain it to you and sell it to you in the sense of like, hey, like, there's needs and wants in all of this. And I think a lot of what, occurs with sales is like you push things on people that they don't need. And for me, with finance, especially in like investing, it's like, does somebody need this thing? And if you're selling something that somebody needs, like there's so many debates about conflicts of interest in this business. And I'm always like, yeah, everyone's got conflicts of interest, but like if I'm selling something that somebody actually needs, and I truly believe they really need this thing or they can really benefit from having this thing, then, am I really conflicted or not? You start getting into this gray area, and those gray areas are like my favorite parts of like all these debates, because it's the interesting, like debatable parts where, you can I get into stupid, arguments sometimes with people on Twitter about like the dumbest things, and like, but it's these gray areas that kind of like force people into like thinking about things. Like, God, I went through like years of having like the active passive debate with people, whether through email or like on Twitter. And I was always like, because active passive to me is always like it's this gray area. No one's really passive and no one's really fully active. It's like this weird sort of spectrum, and there's good ways to do it and bad ways to do it. And to me, though, that's like the interesting part of the debate, is the really murky gray area of like what defines this thing and like who is being active and, who's not. And like, I love those areas of these debates because it's where the kind of rubber meets the road for somebody on what, how to actually apply all this stuff.
Well, that's the religious kid raised by lawyers who goes into marketing before he discovers the markets all works itself out. I think he just nailed it. Jeez. Hey, you never need to go to therapy now. You're solid. You're squared away.
Thank you, Matt.
We're leaving a bunch of stuff out. I am committing. You're now on the part 2 list because, again, so much more to dive into. If people want to find out more, if they want to follow the work, tell them where they can connect with you on the internet, send you fun emails baiting you into active passive debate. So fall for that trap. Where should they look you up?
Cullen Roche at Discipline Funds. Cullen Roche at disciplinefunds.com. And the new blog, I've sunset the Pragmatic Capitalism blog. You can go and search that for all my old content from the last 10 years. But I've kind of transitioned everything to the Discipline Alerts page, which is kind of the new blog where I write, my kind of free thinking content there.
And sign up for those emails. I will say I love getting those in my inbox. You send out great stuff. You always make my brain go in some new direction. I deeply, deeply appreciate it. Cullen, I want to thank you for all the time today. I want to thank you for all the writing. I want to thank you as an industry outsider. I mean, it means a lot when there's other people without the accreditations and whatever else figuring the stuff out in real time, because it tells other people these are conversations we can have. You don't need all the stuff after your name to be a part of this conversation and actively contribute to the discourse. That's why you're truly an intentional investor. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, Matt, I love the blog or the podcast. So thanks for doing it.
Thanks, man. Talk to you soon.
Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe wherever you're watching The Intentional Investor so more people can find our show. You can follow Matt directly at cultishcreative.com or at cultishcreative on Twitter. For more great content at the intersection of investing and life, check out epsilontheory.com or at epsilontheory on Twitter.